Hi, everyone, and welcome to our March session of our Early Childhood Seminar. We are so excited that you joined us today. And today we have with us Renee, and we are so excited that she's here. She's going to talk about a lot of her research that she's done on childcare providers' personal beliefs of their training needs. We all know that training and professional development is such an important part of what we do. And sometimes we get it and sometimes we don't. So she is here to talk about training today and what she has found. And hopefully we will gain some new perspectives and knowledge from what you have found. So Renee, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you guys so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk about my research. I've only got to talk about it one time before, and it was a much shorter time frame. And all of them were like, no, we need longer because this is like a lot of rich data that you have on their teachers and their personal perceptions of the of how their trainings are. And so here's just a little information about myself. I have a PhD in child development. And obviously we're going to be talking about my dissertation. I have a master's in family studies and a bachelor's in human development. I'm currently a graduate teacher, adjunct teacher at Texas Women's University, and I've been there for about 8 years through my PhD. Then I did an internship and I volunteered at the Children's Advocacy Center in Collin County, did some grant writing for them. But for a while, I was a director at Creme de la Creme Child Care Center. And I don't know if you've ever heard of Creme, but it's I like to refer to my students as like the Disney World of childcare. You know, you walk in and you end up in a little French village. So I worked there for a few years, both as a director and as actually a toddler teacher. And in my undergraduate, I actually started off in child life. I was going to actually be a child life specialist, but my husband moved us overseas for a while. And so that kind of interrupted my education for a little bit. But I've been married for 20 plus years and I have 2 daughters. I have an 11-year-old and a 15-year-old. So I'm in full on teenage adolescent craziness in my house. But that's just a little bit about myself. I'm going to go ahead and go into the research itself. But I do have time at the end for questions. But if you want to ask a question, please feel free to pop in. Even with my students, I'm like, if I talk too much, then I bore myself. So I love a more interactive like conversation versus just me, talking. I get bored with my own voice sometimes. So let me introduce you to my research. So we all know that we as childcare providers or educators want to provide like a quality training sources for our teachers, especially in the state of Texas. We were kind of talking about it before, but in the state of Texas, there is no requirement for education. All they have to have in order to be a primary childcare worker or teacher in the classroom is a high school diploma. So obviously training in Texas is very, very important. That's where they're actually getting their knowledge base for working inside the classroom and working with children. And so we do know that it's extremely beneficial, not even just to our teachers that don't have an education, but those who also do, to continue that professional development so that they can continue to see what's changing in childcare, as well as kind of giving the latest curriculum ideas and so forth. So the purpose of the study was, it was a quantitative study, and we examined the kinds of knowledge the childcare workers actually felt that they had. Like, what did they feel they knew the most about? And what did they feel they didn't know the most about? And then we asked them how did they prefer to receive their trainings, which is really interesting to me because in the day and age of online learning, I had a huge assumption that was not actually proven. I was like, oh, that surprised me. And then we also wanted to know, well, what did they actually find useful in their training, or what did they believe would actually be useful for their training? So we gave them a list of childcare topics again and said, which one is most useful for you? And it was actually really interesting to see what they found that wasn't useful, because we had a couple that they scored, not significantly low, but I mean, they were pretty close to like not useful. And then basically they said they were somewhat useful. And then the last thing that we don't have very much research about at all is, what do we know the teachers feel is there a barrier to actually implementing the training in the classroom? Because we have all of these rich trainings that we give them. And what we know is the research shows that they will implement them for a short amount of time. And then after that, they revert back to either their own personal beliefs about childcare or family or those kinds of things. So what we were looking at is, okay, what are these barriers that they have to actually implementing what they've learned in their trainings into the classroom? So that's kind of an overall introduction into like what my paper and what my research was about. So here are my participants. I got lucky. For a while, it took us a while, but I ended up getting 227 participants in the state of Texas that were actually early childhood teachers. And you kind of see the breakdown. We did have 2 male participants, but they were kind of outliers. So and when I was talking to the statistician, I went ahead and we took them out because they were just going to kind of skew the data. And I think really in the future, one of the things I'd like to do is really talk to the male teachers about and see if there's a difference between the male and the female, but we just didn't have enough male participants. Obviously, 60% of them had an associate's degree, which was really surprising to me, but considering where my participant pool came from, I realized why I had such a high education rate, which is my education pool came from the Texas Association of Early Childhood Educators. So you can see every one of my teachers belong to some type of organization. They belong to either NACI, or they belong to the Texas or Child Care Aware, or they belong to something on top of what they were getting at the center, which is really interesting to me because when I worked at the center, not very many of my childcare teachers actually belonged to any of the associations at all. So when I got this, I was like, okay, this is great. But obviously I got them from Texas Association. The other thing is that most of them worked between 6 to 10 years. So most of them hadn't been in childcare a really long time, but none of them had been in it for like less than 5 years. So obviously my participant pool was an educated pool that had at least been working at a childcare center for 10 years, which is a significant amount of time in childcare, especially with the turnover rate that we usually have in childcare. So these teachers kind of already like really knew what they were talking about and had a vast experience inside of it. So it was really interesting to me to kind of look at it. Now, all of my participants came from Texas, obviously, because that's where I'm located. And obviously, because that was kind of one of my limitations or my delimitations. I wanted to focus on the state of Texas. Any questions? Like I said, so these are my research questions. So I had 4 research questions. And really what I was looking at for my particular study was I wanted to see if there was a difference between education and experience level. So really what I was looking at is if they had more education, right? Did they answer the questions differently than the people with less education? Or if they had more experience, did they answer the questions differently than the people that had less experience? So my childcare workers had less experience. So the first question related to knowledge base. So are there differences in childcare providers' perceptions of their level of knowledge on childcare development by education or experience level? For this question in the tool, it was a survey and it was probably like 200 questions, which then we had to narrow down because one of the participants was like, that's a lot of questions. So I think we ended up getting it down to like 125. But this section of the survey basically asked them, here are childcare topics, tell me what you're most knowledgeable at. So they were actually rating themselves on what they felt that they had the most knowledge on. The second research question dealt with where they actually get their trainings from. Where do they prefer to get their trainings from? And so this question just straight up just said, where do you prefer to get your trainings? And then it listed books, it listed college courses, it listed online courses, it listed on-site trainings from the childcare center that they worked at, journal articles, those kinds of things. Very simple, easy question. Research question 3 looked at the differences in their perception of childcare topics that they would find useful. So they were a little bit different than the knowledge one, but they were very similar. So they were just research topics such as, memory and infant development and, stranger anxiety, those kinds of things. And then they rated whether or not they found a training on that particular topic to be useful. Question 4 dealt with the barriers. So what barriers did they have to actually implementing the training? And in those, it was questions related to, was the training provided great information, but in order to implement the training, it was going to cost too much money? Did they go to a training and obviously their childcare center wouldn't allow them to implement it because they had their own curriculum? And we asked some very subjective questions like, I was bored and I really didn't enjoy the training. And that's usually what happens when I'm at a training. Because I did actually want to know that. I mean, I've had several childcare teachers, my employees would come up to me and they'd be like, you sent me to the most boring training ever. And I was like, but I sent you on to training on like infant development. Like, how is that boring? And so I wanted to kind of get an idea of what did they perceive to be like I really just didn't want to implement it. So my research method was a MANOVA. I used the MANOVA obviously because I had more than one group difference. So I was looking at both education and also experience across ages and disciplines and all sorts of things. And so, so I really wanted to make sure I understood how they feel was the biggest impact to their trainings were, as well as, is there a difference between education and is there a difference between experience? But so the unfortunate part of my research is that nothing was significant. So there is no difference in education and there is no difference in experience with the way these particular participants answered the questions. And I had 227 participants. So, I mean, that was a significant pool to not have anything show up significant. So obviously education and experience don't play as big of a part in how we distinguish what they found important, which I was really surprised by. I do think though, like if I take the data and I run it in a different way, I might find something different. So like I still have their race that I could look at. I have a bunch of other ways that I can actually change the data. I didn't actually directly compare experience and education. I was just looking at the actual question related to education, and then I separated it out and then looked at it as experience. So I didn't actually even cross-reference it because obviously since neither one was significant, there wasn't a point to actually cross-reference it. But one of the statisticians recommended that I look into that because I might find that there is a difference between the two when they're like referenced. But that was for a different paper. I really wanted to graduate. So, so using, however, for our topic, I'm going to show you guys the descriptive statistics because what we actually learned from those, the way they answered the questions was really interesting. And that's actually what the focus of my discussion was, which was how they actually answered all 4 research questions and kind of look at the ideas and how we can use this information for future research. So I'm going to go into that next. And if I'm talking too fast, let me know, because I have a tendency, my students are always like, Sarah, you're really, really, really fast. So here's the first. These are the topics that we looked at for base knowledge. And what I did was I sorted them by, oh, I can't see that. Hold on, let me move you guys because I can't see my numbers here. There we go. I sorted them from smallest to greatest. So smallest being that they recommended that they did not have strong knowledge base about this. So obviously they felt they had some knowledge, but they did not actually feel strongly about it. Now you can see from the numbers, they're all in the 3s. So they're all saying that they have this, they feel like they have a strong, somewhat strong knowledge base about all of the topics, obviously, which is what made it hard to rule out anything significant. However, you can see that child's memory is like a 3.1. So it barely made it to what was considered, because a 2, basically, they said that they had a little bit of knowledge, but not significant. So they felt like they knew the topic, but they didn't know it well. Um, and in that case, it's really just that they know of it, right? Um, and so those 3 topics were child's memory, moral development, and aggression. And I thought it was interesting that they didn't feel like they had a strong or significant about aggression, because later on you'll see that, like, obviously classroom management is one of their biggest, they want to understand classroom management. And so you'll see that in the reverse, what they felt they knew the most about was communicating with parents. um, it was almost a 4, which is, that's their biggest, they know everything about it, is basically they feel like they're solid on of that. The other thing that's really interesting about the just demographics, I gotta move you guys over, is if you'll see on my chart, I don't even know, I guess I could, I don't know if I can, like, here, there we go. So the one is that they had no knowledge. So obviously, some of the participants in these 3 topics had no knowledge of child care, memory, a children's memory, moral development, or aggression. And you can see that throughout a lot of them, there were participants that actually felt like they didn't have anything. But when you get kind of down here, what you'll see is that they all start with 2, which means they all felt like, all 227 participants where there is a 2 with it as the minimum, means nobody in those categories felt like they had no knowledge of these particular topics, which is kind of reassuring when you kind of look at what those topics are. Obviously, it's play style, separation anxiety. These are things that we focus on in the Child Care Center for trainings early on. So in the state of Texas, we require certain childcare trainings to be done before a childcare teacher can even be put into the classroom. And obviously, these are those topics. So they talk about separation, they talk about parent communication. I was a little disappointed that abuse and neglect had somebody that put a 1. Because, like I said, all of these topics, including understanding child's understanding of feelings, are things that are discussed before the child care teacher actually gets into the classroom. And so Dr. Rose and I, my academic advisor, were like, okay, well, at least we know that the initial trainings that are happening at the very beginning before they actually start working are making some type of impact into their knowledge base, because they're actually saying they actually do know some of those topics. But I started researching a little bit more into child's memory, and, obviously, and I started realizing probably why they have an issue with this particular topic. However, it's a really important topic, and I'm hoping to start training or doing trainings on children's memory for some of the childcare centers that I kind of still connect with as a role director, just because I feel like it's one of those important topics of how do we help the child learn to build their memory base, and all of that. Any questions? I'm so, like I said, I don't like hearing the sound of my own voice for too long. I'll keep going.
I had a question about, and I think you answered it, and I'm the same way about listening to myself talk. So when did you conduct the research? What year was it?
It was right before COVID. So it'd be interesting to see how they answer the questions now.
Yeah, I was thinking about that, and then the anti-bias curriculum and materials, which has
Yes,
become, a heavily talked about topic recently.
correct. Yeah. So, and it's actually interesting because I was talking to one of my other colleagues who her research, she works at Charlton now, and she just did research somewhat similar to this, but she did it post COVID, and she said it was really interesting to see kind of, the shift to cleanliness and germs and that kind of information versus the actual curriculum, and they're definitely started to focus more in on the emotional development, obviously because kids are in stress right now. So it was really interesting because she was like, it's so interesting to look at your data post COVID and look at my data, you know,
Yeah.
after COVID, so,
Well,
or pre-COVID,
presenting a
pre-COVID,
follow-up.
post-COVID. Yeah.
I see you can probably revisit and see if it's changed.
Yes. And so, yeah, because we talked about that too. I was like, once I can, like, I want to try to get this research published first so that I can have that as a base. But then I want to go back and visit, just because I still have a lot of questions, as you'll see at the end, related to their knowledge base and why they think they know so much about certain topics. I mean, obviously I made a hypothesis based on the fact that I know that those are topics that are discussed, in their initial trainings, but it'd be interesting to know, like, is that really the case?
Hey, Sydney, it was asked in the chat, and I'm actually interested too. What was your original sample size? Like, how many did you hope to get?
So my original sample size that I needed for it to be significant was only like, so what you have to know is, in order for me to even get the 227, it took me almost a year.
Wow.
And I was struggling because I had like 60 participants for close to 6 to 7 months. And originally, the bare minimum, they're like, the bare minimum for you to actually be able to do your thing has to be 150. So I was like, I am never going to graduate, is basically I decided. I was like, I'm going to never graduate. But then I reached out to the Texas Association for Early Childhood Educators and I kind of pleaded my case, and they sent it to everybody. And I ended up with 325 originally. Like one day it just started blowing. They must have emailed it out, and I could see like they were just coming in and coming in and coming in and coming in. But we had to kind of go through and clean up the data. Like a lot of them, obviously the survey wasn't small. So they would get halfway through the survey and then they'd stop. And so I was like, obviously I can't count those. I mean, I could count them for the topics that they actually went through, but a lot of them like fell off. So the true was only the 227.
So how many were in that Texas ECE? Do you know how many they sent out? How many emails?
So from what I understand, it went out to everybody in their network, which is thousands of people.
Thousands. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so that was my question in the chat. So thanks, Kathleen, for following up with that. This is Jackie. I'm
Hi.
curious then. So you said 150. I was thinking a percentage. Let's say that, you know, that the population is 100 and you had 10 respondents. Well, that's 10%. So that's, you work with that. So that's what I was trying to understand. If it went out to you know, where'd the 150 come from is my follow-up question. I'm just
So the
curious.
150 came out. So I used G-Power to put in like the type of statistical test that I was going to run, and what power I wanted to have. And when I calculated that, G-Power told me I needed 150 participants in order for my research to actually be valid, and reliable. So that's where the original 150 came from.
Okay.
But
Well,
obviously I
Kathleen
sat
and
at
I are
60
on
for
the,
like,
I'm sorry, Kathleen and I are on the IRB committee here at the University of Arizona Global Campus. So we're kind of geeky like that. So I appreciate
no, I totally, like, I can't even tell you, like, I must have cried like a million times. I was like, I'm never going to graduate. And then Dr. Rose was like, you've got to try to play. So then obviously I had to do an IRB amendment, because at that point I had decided I'm going to reach out to the actual associations, and I hadn't actually put that in my IRB. And so we did the adjustment, and then I reached out to them, and I mean, literally I had to talk to 2 to 3 people with the association before they agreed to actually email it out. Now, obviously my research was important to them. This is the things they want to know because they're providing the trainings here in Texas for all of our teachers. And so they were like, well, we kind of need to know this information. You're right, we don't know it. And so I think that's how I got in, and how I ended up with my 220. I mean, that's, even Dr. Rose was like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do with this data now?
that's a good
But
problem to
obviously,
have.
Huh?
Absolutely a good problem to have. So
Yeah, it was
now
really,
has
it
the
was really
association come back to you and said, hey, what are you hearing?
Yes, and so I already I presented a poster presentation, but they want me to do a full presentation, obviously, because we could only talk for like 20 minutes about the topic, and everybody was like, but wait, I have a question, what about this? And well, did you look at this? And and a lot of them wanted to know, like, why did I only have female participants? And I was like, because even with the 350 that I originally started with, there were still only 2 male participants. And we just considered them outliers. So it was just more important to look at the data that I had than to keep them in the pot. So any other questions? I love it. I'm going to go on to the next research question. And this is because this is the one. So obviously, oh no, let's see. Oh, I know, it was actually my next research question. Is this one. Preference for training. So what I basically did was, this is basically, I just put in the question, where types of trainings you like, and then they were supposed to click the ones that they liked, or click the one that they liked the most. And as you can see, their percentage of, like 27% wanted on-site training, which when I was doing my actual research for my literature review, the research actually showed that the teachers prefer their trainings to be on site. They don't want to have to go online. They don't want to have to do anything extra. They want the trainings to come to them at the child care center, which was surprising to me, because I would have thought that online courses would have been the way everybody goes, because you can just do it whenever you want to do it. So obviously offsite trainings are next, professional conferences, college courses, books, and preferences. But what I realized from this is a couple of things. When we were kind of problem solving, I was looking at the literature for the discussion. I realized on-site trainings are free because obviously the child care center provides them. They're done during work hours. So if they have children, there's childcare that's usually provided, right? Because their child is actually either at the center or in school. It's not done on their own time. It's done in their work hours. And so it's convenient. So I found that, sorry, hit the next button. So I found it really interesting as I dug into why the teachers would think on-site training was better and the workshops being held in the center. And I feel like, especially with COVID right now, that's really hard. That is not actually the option that our child care workers are getting now. Now online courses are the way that we go. Now the difference, I wonder, which obviously these are, post-COVID questions, is the child care center preventing, the payment for the online courses? Now I know at CREM, if a teacher wanted to take an online course, CREM paid for all of their online courses. Like, we had an association that we worked with that provided the teachers with those online courses. I do think that that's probably the way we're going to go, but the teachers actually prefer to get the trainings in-house and at the centers, which was really surprising to me, because I was always like, I want to go someplace. Let me go to a hotel. I want to go to a conference. But obviously there wasn't even anything significant related to education or experience with this either. There was no difference. It was pretty much everybody wanted to be at the child care center. So, which I just, it confirmed previous research that said that, but I just still, for me, it was a surprise. I don't know for y'all, but for me, I was like, I want to get out. So the next thing is usefulness. This question basically asked whether or not the teachers found, like, which trainings they found to be most useful for them. And so for the purpose for you guys, I highlighted the 3 lowest and the 3 highest. And as you can see, like the other spreadsheet that I showed you, 1 means that they didn't find it useful at all. So all of these topics had childcare providers that said that these topics weren't useful, which I thought was really interesting. That in the other slide, I had people who were like, no, I totally know about this topic. Nobody listed it as a 1. But in this topic, obviously, at some point, somebody, all of them were like, I don't find this useful. But what we were really surprised by is what the 3 that they didn't really find useful were. So this scale was actually a little bit bigger. It was through 5, obviously, 1 through 5. But you can see it's like a 3.67, which means they were kind of on the fence on whether or not they needed to be trained on this at all. And our biggest shock was that it was infant development. That they didn't see value in infant development. I was like, holy moly, you don't understand how important that is. And I didn't put it on here, but I think when I was looking at the breakdown of, oh, actually I did put it on here. You can see on here that I talked about the semi breakdown of education related to some of the topics that had kind of medium scores, and that we found that the biggest issue with whether or not they found it useful was in shaken baby syndrome, and whether or not they found that it was useful. And there was a difference between an associate's and a bachelor and a graduate degree when we pulled out the data and kind of looked at it from just a perspective of who gave us what scores. And so Dr. Rose and I were like, oh my gosh, like they don't think infant development is good. And if they have, obviously I figured if they have no education, then obviously that's why they found the CPR and the shaken baby to be more important than those with a degree, right? Because I think they feel like, well, we've already gotten that information in school, so I don't need to get it anymore. But, that's all speculation. These are all things that Dr. Rose is like, we need to ask that question. So as you can see the topics and you can see the grade. It's a much bigger grade than in what they felt they knew. They feel like the most useful things are classroom management, DAP, social development, and emotional development, which is great because those are the things that we really are focusing on right now. But it's interesting to me that they don't find art projects or science projects or obviously infant development and shaken baby syndrome to be important things that they need to know, or that they should be trained on. Because I suspect that has to do with the fact that they work in the 4-year-old classroom and they're like, I don't need to be trained on infant development. But I mean, from my perspective, especially since I used to be a toddler teacher, the foundation of everything is in the infant development. And so if you don't understand how that works, then, and that just could be me. That's me. And stuff. And I do agree. I'm looking at y'all's questions. I do think that because they had so much experience and they had some bit of education, that maybe that's why the topics they put as not useful. Obviously, we know as educators that education and that development and theories related to development are constantly changing. And so I think it's important that we help them see that those topics are still very useful to them. Obviously, they maybe, I was really shocked. But again, like I said, for me, it's one of those things. I was in toddler land, so those people are my favorite people. So, but yeah, so you can kind of see. Do you guys have any questions about this one? Because this was the other thing that I found really interesting about my data. Because the grade, how different those 3s are huge. Because that's like saying that these things aren't useful to them, and I just can't imagine that art projects and science projects aren't useful to them, like in the classroom, because they can be incorporated into classroom management. They can be incorporated into, I mean, obviously you have to be able to understand how to do them in order to make them developmentally appropriate. So, and we've had such a big push for STEM or STEAM that I was shocked that but again, like you said, it could be that they just feel like they're all talked out about it. So, any other questions? I think I answered that one. Okay. So I'm going to go into barriers. if I can get
Hi,
this.
Sydney. I just wanted to add that your data was a cross-sectional collection, right? So I wonder if making it longitudinal, we would see that those would increase and decrease in what's important as folks went along their continuum. So let's say you're in toddlerland and then you get switched up to pre-K, then maybe those things at the bottom become more important again. So I think cross-sectionally, this looks very appropriate as a teacher. I want to know, how can I keep my kids busy in the classroom while learning?
Right.
The other things I've learned, and I'll catch up if I need to, or if I go from 4th grade, say someone puts me in 8th grade as a teacher. So yeah, so it makes complete sense that those things might not be as low or high at the moment.
Right. And I agree with that, because that we thought that was a big thing, was obviously maybe I didn't have very many infant teachers. I had a lot of maybe kindergarten teachers and, 1st grade teachers or pre-K 4 teachers who don't have any need for infant development. They're like, that's not who I'm dealing with right now. So I agree with that. And that was actually that's one of the things I said in my discussion, was obviously I had teachers who, because I didn't actually ask that. I didn't ask what grade they taught. So I didn't know what I was looking at related to where in the classroom they were actually working. So these are the barriers. So as you can see, they could be very subjective. When we first came up with the tool didn't actually have a barrier section. And so we did a bunch of research and looked at what was the research showing that might be barriers, right? Because obviously nobody's ever asked this question before, which is really bizarre to me. Like, I couldn't find any research on what teachers felt were barriers to them actually implementing the training. Even within like studies that said, we taught them, we did a 3-week session teaching them about, infant development and how this works. And then we went back later and saw how they were doing in the classroom. Even within those sections, at the end, they never actually asked the teachers why they reverted back to doing things the way they used to do, or what issues they had actually continuing to do the training information or the training knowledge that they had kind of gained. We just didn't know. It was just, they went back. And a lot of them, there was the idea that it's definitely personal related, that, it's hard for habits to change. So if you've been a teacher for 25 years and you've been doing it for 25 years and you get a new way of doing it, then you just naturally revert back to kind of, doing it the way you did it before. So when we made the actual barrier tool, it had never been tested before. And so that was a huge limitation for this study, for my study, is that we didn't section this off and just do like a pilot study and have these questions actually tested. So obviously now they've been tested, and so definitely need to be reformulated and looked at in a different way. But so kind of, you can see that what we asked was, what do you feel like these were barriers to you actually being able to implement them inside the classroom? And so we said, I don't usually pay attention to the training because they aren't enjoyable. Like, why? I don't really enjoy going to the training. The trainings are hard to understand. I don't usually agree with what I'm learning in the training. The director is not supportive of me implementing these trainings in the classroom. I'd rather do things the way I do it. I think I do it best. There was a study done, where we just kind of talk about self-efficacy and the idea of like their personal beliefs and how they implement them in the classroom. And that's kind of where these questions came from. The idea that they have their own personal beliefs and they use those in the classroom versus the trainings that they receive. So that's kind of where that came from. And then we kind of asked just general, like not concept question, but general, like actual physical barriers. There's like emotional and kind of, personal belief barriers. And then there's the, I can't use the curriculum because my school uses a different one. There's not enough time for me to implement the training in my classroom. The materials weren't provided for me. The training doesn't apply to my age group. And often it's too expensive to implement the training. Now, obviously that was the highest one, that obviously they would do these trainings. And a lot of times, you know, we go to these big conferences and we send the teachers to them, and they get like all this information from different organizations that are providing curriculum. And then the teachers can't implement it because it's too expensive. The crafts are too expensive. The the materials needed, the tools, the books, all of that stuff. Obviously, the teachers can't afford to provide that into the classroom, and the center can't do it either. So obviously, that we were not surprised to see that that's actually the biggest barrier to implementation, which is that often it's too expensive to actually implement the training in the classroom. So then it becomes, okay, so how do we help them implement it in the classroom? How do we alleviate some of these higher number barriers so that when we're providing the trainings, we're not just talking to air and just saying, we actually want them to actually really put them into the classroom. Obviously, they didn't really rate the more subjective ones very high. So they were like, well, no, I mean, I pay attention, I see value. Obviously, I had educated NACI members, so obviously these were not going to be the answers that they give. It would have been interesting if I had childcare workers in the lower income areas and seeing how that would have changed. So we talked about that too, but obviously getting them to actually answer the survey was going to be a feat. So here are the implications to actually what my research provided, and kind of when I've even talked to my other colleagues, obviously Dr. Lisa Cook over at Charlton and I were talking about this because obviously her data is looking at what's happened since COVID. But childcare providers perceive that they have some knowledge of childcare topics, which is great. I was glad to see that they didn't feel like they were completely lost. And so the trainings are doing what they're supposed to be doing. They are trying to get them to increase their knowledge base, especially in the state of Texas, where, some of them, obviously not my particular sample size, but for the most part, we want to make sure we're giving them everything we can if they don't have an education base. Childcare providers perceive that all knowledge listed in the survey at somewhat was valuable. So they do find usefulness in things. It's just was surprising what they didn't find useful. So, but for the most part, they were really working towards understanding all the topics provided in that particular part of the survey. Childcare providers prefer on-site training, which I think childcare workers, or childcare administrations, this is a big one for them. And that is they're providing childcare trainings at the childcare center in a way that is accessible to their teachers, especially if there's obstacles, including if they have children and providing childcare, those kinds of things. And then this is really a starting point for understanding the barriers that teachers perceive to actually implementing their trainings in the classroom. Like I said, it was an unused tool. Obviously now it's been used, it needs to be tweaked, but we still have a long way to go to figure out why the teachers revert back, why they don't want to implement it, those kinds of topics, or why they don't use some of the trainings that they have. So, so future research, I have 4 things that I would love to see happen, and that is, hold on, I can't read. Identify how childcare workers obtain their knowledge base. So where are they actually getting the knowledge base? And I think that's important to know. So are they getting it at their initial trainings when the first 18 hours that are provided by the actual childcare center in order for them to be entering into the classroom? Are they going to, conferences? Are they getting it from that they're in school? Those kinds of things. So I want to know where they actually really feel they got that information from. So did they get it from a training? Those kinds of things. So then asking the topics and say, well, where did you learn this topic from? So it's kind of a broader look at where they actually receive their trainings. Examine childcare providers' perceptions of quality. I think that was actually really key that we didn't like kind of hone into. I didn't ask them what their perceptions of quality were. We do have some research on what they think about quality, but it's very little and it's old. So I think we need to re-examine what they feel is important to making them quality teachers and also the quality care that they provide the kids. 3, I think we need to look at, examine the different types of barriers that childcare providers have in implementing the trainings. I think it's a really good piece of information that we need to understand so that when we're providing these trainings, we can kind of hone in on those things that actually keep them from putting them into the classroom and provide strategies. So, you know, if we're providing all this curriculum-based training, how can they get it inexpensively? You know, how can we help them implement it in their classroom? And, you know, asking the questions like, you know, what does your childcare, you know, center allow you to do? So that even when we're giving that kind of type of training on curriculum and things that they can do in the classroom, providing ways for them to kind of strategize if they can't actually do it exactly the same. And then obviously examine subject area childcare providers feel they need more useful and why. Information. I almost wanted to ask, you know, why don't you find it useful and actually understand why they answered the way they did, right? Because it could be, like you said, as simple as at that particular moment, they're in the kindergarten classroom. Or that particular moment they're in, or they had just had like 6 trainings on STEM, you know, and they're, you know, they're kind of like, I've been beaten down by the STEM trainings, you know, because I mean, obviously that was a big push in the last few years with STEM. And so that could be why the arts and science were kind of at the lower end, because they feel like, okay, like I've gotten all that I can get from it. So, you know, those kinds of questions, really expanding on the information. Dr. Rose and I talked about that it really maybe the next step would be qualitative and like looking at getting like deep answers and then going back and redoing the tool and like narrowing it down. But obviously that's for another day and stuff. So any questions?
Wow, Renee, that was amazing. I actually had one question.
Sure.
Why do you consider the men outliers? Like, were they different?
Yes, they were. They were, when we saw them, when I put them on the scatter plot, they were like, all of their answers were completely different.
Why do you think that was?
You know, I don't know. And actually that was one of the things I wish I had more, like, because Dr. Rose and I talked about it and she was like, even if you had like 15, like to be, if they all 15 were this outlier, then I would have probably amended my research again and looked at it based on sex. So I don't know if it's just that they look at things differently. Obviously they handle situations differently. But yeah, they were really big outliers. And the statistician was like, you can keep them in, but they're not fitting in anything. And she's like, it's almost, and their data won't be like, they wouldn't even fall into the equation correctly. So that was the real disappointing part, that I didn't have more male teachers. But obviously, I mean, the male teacher population is really, really small. I mean, in order to get
right. I think it's interesting when you're hiring as an administrator, what they're seeing differently.
No, I totally agree. And so like we had 3 male teachers when I worked at CREM, and I almost sent it to them, but they're not in childcare anymore. So I was like, yeah,
that's very cool. Okay, I was just curious. Anybody else want to pop on real quick? Questions? Did we get everybody's questions in the chat? I know that this was full of really great information, so I want to make sure that we answer everyone's questions. It will be housed on YouTube after this, so you can go back and watch it if need be. We can also, Renee, do you want to put your contact information in the
Oh
chat
yes,
box?
absolutely. I will put that in there. And then also, like, it is interesting I didn't put all the charts because obviously that would be extremely overwhelming, but some of the charts, when you look at them and you break them down by education and you break them down by experience, it's not significant, but you can see, like, when you're looking at the numbers, what's happening with the thing. And so it's just really interesting. I was really disappointed that nothing was significant, because we had so many participants. Like Dr. Rose and I were like, yay. And then we were like, no. And I was like, and such is research.
Exactly. And I think all of us have probably either worked on a dissertation, been on a dissertation committee, worked with students, so we all have seen that. Anybody else want to pop on before we hang up? She did put her contact information in the chat box. And I just want to thank everybody so much for coming. This was awesome. Something a little different. We haven't had a lot of people come and share research. So we appreciate that very much. And maybe we can have you back and see what else you're doing with this. But if no one has questions, we are finished for today. And thank you for coming.
Thank you guys.
Thank you, Renee.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much. That was wonderful.